Morning, folks. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Downing Street is at war with Fleet Street this morning. The co-chair of the Tory party denies describing activists as mad, swivel-eyed loons, as reported by 3 national newspapers. That's our top story. A large part of the Conservative Party would give the EU nil point. But what's the Liberal Democrats' Eurovision? Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, joins us for the Sunday interview. Could we have joint Conservative UKIP candidates at the next election? Downing Street's rejected the idea, but some of the party's backbenchers favour a deal. 2 MPs with opposing views go head to head.
In the Northwest, once dubbed the Wild West without a sheriff, now there's a new Manx message over tax. We have the Chief Minister on his agreement with the UK.
And with me, Sunday's finest political panel. Miranda Green, Janan Ganesh and Nick Watt. They'll be tweeting like swivel-eyed loons, to quote a phrase, throughout the programme. So let's start with Loongate, or Swivelgate, or It Wasn't Me Gate. The Conservative Party has denied that anyone in Downing Street used the phrase mad, swivel-eyed loons to describe Conservative activists. Perish the thought, they say, even if they are Eurosceptic and opposed to gay marriage. But the claims appeared in The Times, The Telegraph and The Mirror, who ascribed the words anonymously but sourced them to a senior Tory who was in the Prime Minister's social circle. Now that sparked a Twitter storm yesterday, which Andrew Feldman, a Cameron mate from his Oxford days, whom he made co-chair of his party, to say that he hadn't said anything of the sort. This morning, there's a standoff between Downing Street and Fleet Street. Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt was asked about the claims on the Marr Show this morning.
The person who is alleged to have said that has denied it, and I know the individual and I trust him. He's a man of great honour.
You don't think he said it?
I don't believe he did, no.
And you don't think anybody else said it? Because last year we were told the Prime Minister was saying it.
Well, if you look at, it certainly doesn't reflect the views of the Prime Minister. And if you look at this Prime Minister, so much of what he's done has been informed by the views and the opinions of hard-working, grassroots Conservative campaigners, whose views, incidentally, are very much in tune with the vast majority of the British people.
Nick, I would suggest this is toxic for Mr Cameron, because regardless of who said it, or if it was said at all, a lot of Tory backbenchers and activists think this is what Mr Cameron really believes about his people.
Yes, I was just going to say, I mean, how would Jeremy Hunt know what Lord Feldman said? I mean, he was down the road at Teddy Hall whilst Dave and Andrew were playing tennis, I think, in the Brasenose tennis team in the 1980s. No, you're absolutely right. It is toxic. It feels a bit like the Andrew Mitchell affair, where Andrew Mitchell strenuously denied calling the police plebs, but the perception was that he had. Andrew Feldman strenuously denies having made these remarks, but the perception is that that is what the Cameron elite think about the party, and it's interesting. Jeremy Hunt says Lord Feldman didn't say that, but Nadine Dorris, just brought back into the Tory fold, does not believe his denials. And essentially, as you're saying, we've now got a standoff between 2 journalists who did hear these remarks and Lord Feldman, who says that he didn't say them. But let's not forget, there's only 3 people who heard that conversation, those 2 journalists and Feldman. It's their word against his.
It is indeed, but the one thing we're clear about this morning is it's not a question of if Feldman did not say this, somebody else said it. It's either he said it or he didn't. There's nobody else involved, which makes it quite a Downing Street, Fleet Street battle.
It does, which is it comes at an extremely inconvenient time for David Cameron, because the last thing he needs when he's been plunged into this terrible crisis battle with his own backbenchers is also a simultaneous battle with his Conservative associations and with the press. But I think also, you know, it is quite interesting to me that it's a peer parachuted into the central, functioning of the government who may well have got them in this trouble, because, of course, peers in the government don't actually have to face the electorate, and they don't have local associations to deal with. They don't have the machinery of the party. So their relationship with electoral politics is totally absent, and I think they often lack insight. So I'm not actually that surprised that the peers
we
got
learned
in trouble.
this morning, going back into the cuts, that the Financial Times had done a profile of Mr Cameron a while back. And roughly the same sort of phrase appeared in that profile. And who was one of the main briefers of that profile, off the record, was Andrew Feldman.
Yeah, and I think one of the damaging things about this story is that whether or not Feldman said it, whether or not David Cameron has said it, it's something you could plausibly imagine both of them, and most damagingly Cameron himself, saying. It reflects his and his friends' attitude towards the grassroots, which is dismissive, and which is more than reciprocated by the grassroots. I just think that we could do without some of the confected outrage we've seen recently. We've known that there is this disparaging view from Number 10 towards the party, and that view is more than returned. All we've learned over the past 48 hours is that there is someone in Number 10 who is unprofessional enough to give expression to those private thoughts at a dinner which, although it's nominally private, things always leak out. We go to these kinds of dinners in Westminster.
But they weren't at the dinner. He was at a dinner of Conservative Friends of Pakistan.
It's really important to remember that it wasn't said at the dinner.
No.
He came out of the dinner,
yes,
bumped into these journalists. One of the journalists said, that vote went very well, didn't it? And he evidently made an argument that it's not the MPs that are a problem, it's the pressure from their associations. He made that argument, and then the journalists say he made this particularly toxic remark. And Downing Street seemed to be suggesting he made these remarks at the dinner. No, he didn't.
No.
Downing Street seems to be suggesting that there is another witness who can claim he didn't make these remarks. No, there isn't. There were 3 other people at the table, one of whom is the Prime Minister's former press secretary, Steve Field. He didn't hear the remarks, and neither did the other 2 journalists here at the dinner. So it's basically the 2 journalists who heard it against Lord Feldman.
I mean, this gives the potential to be quite serious. This has appeared in the Times, the Telegraph and the Mirror. Not known allies. I mean, the Times and Telegraph are great rivals. The Mirror has not knowingly colluded in recent memory with the Telegraph or the Times. I mean, somebody's not telling the truth here. Either, to be blunt, either this was made up, they colluded, or something along these lines was said. I mean, what other possible alternative could there be?
I mean, it does smack to me of extraordinary lack of self-discipline by somebody at the heart of the Cameron operation to me, although I do actually share Jalad's view that some of the incredible sort of outrage is overblown.
Pakistan dinner, you can't even blame having a drink. Good
point.
All right, we shall see. The ball's in the paper's courts now. Let's see what they come out with. Last night, millions voted on one of the most important issues facing Europe, and the result? Denmark won the Eurovision Song Contest with only Teardrops, sung by Emily de Forest. Back in Blighty, it's sometimes hard to see the wood from the trees when it comes to having a vote on our membership of the European Union. It's a question which can cause a lot of tears between Conservatives and their Lib Dem coalition partners. Under the coalition agreement, Liberal Democrats supported a law which would mean holding a referendum before any further powers could be transferred to Brussels. But in January, David Cameron went further, promising a referendum in 2017 on whether to leave the EU if he wins a majority at the next general election. Conservative MPs want that commitment enshrined in law, and on Wednesday over 100 of them said it should have been in the Queen's speech. But that's something Lib Dems won't countenance. Now the PM's ordered the drafting of a referendum bill that's been picked up by one of his backbenchers, and Lib Dems are furious that the Tory leadership is aiding and abetting its MPs in what they claim is undermining the coalition agreement. But at PMQs this week, where Nick Clegg was standing in for Mr Cameron, Tories accused him of going back on his own commitment to hold an in-out referendum.
Was that man an imposter or just a hypocrite?
And Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Senior Lib Dem, Danny Alexander, he joins me now for the Sunday interview. Danny Alexander, welcome. Let's begin right away. Have a look at this leaflet. It's a Lib Dem leaflet from 2008. And in this leaflet, we just get it up on the screen, there it is, a smiling picture of a younger looking Nick Clegg in these days. In this leaflet, your party promised an in-out referendum. Indeed, at the bottom, you're even urging people to sign your petition calling for an in-out referendum. just Lib Dem hot air, wasn't it?
Well, at the election, and indeed in that leaflet, what we said, as Nick Clegg said in Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, was we said that there should be a referendum the next time that there's a major change in the European treaties, the next time at which there's a major attempted handover of power. And of course, that's what we've legislated for. You showed in your introduction there the European Union Act that we passed last year, 100 days of parliamentary time. It was something that Liberal Democrats and Conservatives agreed to do in the coalition agreement. And what that does is it puts in place a referendum lock that means that the next time there's a major treaty change at a European level, the British people will have a vote. That's what we've campaigned for in the past, and that's what we now can be absolutely certain will now happen.
If we can keep that leaflet up, please. The problem is, Mr. Alexander, that Lib Dem 2008 leaflet doesn't say that. The referendum pledge was not based on a major treaty change. Indeed, your party, in that leaflet, specifically dismisses the need for a referendum on a treaty change in Lisbon. Mr. Clegg attacks the Tories for offering only a referendum, a limited referendum. He says only the Lib Dems would give voters an in-out referendum, untied to any treaty change. So I ask again, why did you ditch the pledge?
Well, what I'm referring to, of course, is what we promised in our election manifesto. What we said in our manifesto was the next time there was a major change in the European Union treaties, there should be a referendum. Of course, that would be absolutely right, because at that point there would have been a discussion, and that's what we said to the British people in 2010.
I accept that.
And that's what we've legislated to make happen through the coalition government.
The 2010 manifesto, by then you were linking a referendum to treaty changes. But that's not what the 2008 leaflet did at all. It did the opposite. And neither did Mr. Clegg at the time. This is Mr. Clegg. Let's listen and see him in 2008.
All three parties supported a referendum on the EU constitution at the last election. And that promise must now be fulfilled. It should be fulfilled, quite simply, by asking the British people the real question, the question that matters to them. Should we stay in the European Union or should we leave? Are we in or are we out? If the Conservatives were honest about this issue, they'd ask that same question too. Their opportunism is breathtaking.
Couldn't have been clearer, could he, there? He said in 2008 the people deserved an in-out referendum, not linked to treaty change at all. Why did you change your mind?
Well, in fact, what he said at the start of that was all parties had promised a referendum linked to a treaty change that hadn't been delivered.
And he's now promising one that is not linked to treaty change, Daniel Alexander. The words are quite clear in the leaflet. They're quite clear in what he's saying. Indeed, he attacks the Tories for linking it to treaty change. Why did you change your view that we should have a simple in-out referendum to one that we'd only have one linked to treaty change?
Well, in fact, that policy was brought forward at a time in 2008 when there was a debate about should there or should there not be a referendum on the treaty that was then before Parliament.
But you were against referendum.
It was that same treaty on which other parties had promised referendums and not delivered them. That's why we said that in future, if we had a chance to legislate, which we have now had in this Parliament.
No, we did, Alexander. You're rewriting history.
I'm not rewriting
history. In 2008, Lib Dem MPs, they stormed out of the Commons in a huff because you were denied a vote, not on treaty change, because that was going to be given. You were denied a vote on holding an in-out referendum. Your party said it was an outrageous affront to democracy. And yet now the party, the Conservatives, are offering an in-out referendum. You say that you won't support it. I mean, that is opportunism.
Actually, that debate in 2008 was precisely about should there be a referendum or not in relation to the treaty that was then going through Parliament. And what I'm saying is,
your party,
we have legislated. Andrew, let me
put this point to you. Then I'll let you speak. Your party moved an amendment to what the Conservatives were trying to do, saying, let's have an in-out referendum regardless of treaty change. You felt so strongly about it that Ed Davey got kicked out of the Commons.
And in 2010, in our manifesto, we put forward a promise that there should be a referendum the next time that there's a major change in...
So why did you change your mind?
In the European treaties. Look, the reason why we don't think that it's right to be pursuing an in-out referendum apropos of nothing at the moment is the two major reasons. Firstly, it's the wrong priority for the country. We've spent in the last 18 months 100 days of parliamentary time passing a referendum.
I understand.
Just at a time.
Why was it the right priority in 2008?
Just at a time when the economy is starting to show a little bit more momentum. The Parliament and government should be focused on jobs and focused on growth and reforming public services. The idea that we should drag ourselves through another debate about a European referendum now, I think is totally wrong.
I perfectly understand that as a legitimate point of view. But why didn't you have that point of view in 2008 when you did call for an in-out referendum unlinked to any treaty change?
Because, as I say, in 2008, that was a specific response to a debate which was about should there or should there not be a referendum on a treaty that was then going through Parliament. We argued that that was the appropriate way to deal with it at that time. In our manifesto, that treaty having been passed, we thought that the right thing to do was to say that the next time...
You dropped the idea of an in-out referendum.
The next time there's a treaty, there should be a referendum. Not only have we kept that pledge, we've legislated for it.
But you changed your mind.
So under any future government, there will have to legally be a referendum the next time there's a treaty.
I understand that, but you changed your mind. And it's because you changed your mind that people don't trust you on referendum.
Well, I think there is no better guarantee for people who think that the next time, as I do, the next time there is a major change in the European treaties, that the British people should be consulted and have a say in a referendum, than the fact that there is a law saying that has been put onto the statute book by Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, opposed by the Labour Party. I think that is the right place to rest, and we should move on and focus on jobs and growth in this country.
Let's move on. Is it your expectation that the coalition will survive intact until the election in 2015?
Yes, absolutely it is.
Downing Street now expects UKIP to come first in next year's Euro elections. They're saying that privately. You've probably heard them say it too. Expects the Lib Dems to do even worse than the Tories, coming fourth or maybe even fifth. Downing Street then thinks there may be a leadership challenge to Mr Clegg from Mr Cable. What's wrong with that analysis?
I think everything's wrong with that analysis. Look, we came together in 2010 as two parties to sort out the major economic mess that was left by the previous Labour government. We are putting through major changes, taking difficult decisions to do that. You know, some people at the time in 2010 said that it would be difficult to keep a coalition going because one party might not be able to remain united and disciplined. Let me reassure you and your viewers that Liberal Democrats will make sure that this government continues to be strong and stable enough to be able to take the difficult decisions in the years to come, no matter what's happening in other parties.
So Downing Street should not be making contingency plans for a Cable-led party post the European elections to walk out sometime in the second half of 2014?
Of course not. It's completely ridiculous distraction from their own political problems. It certainly won't happen. What will happen is that this coalition government will deliver a Queen's speech which is full of radical measures, reforms to social care, reforms to pensions, support to small businesses to take on more staff, major changes in this country. You know, we as Liberal Democrats are committed to having a strong and stable government. Sometimes it's difficult when other parties have internal difficulties, but we will make sure that we deliver the right things for the country.
Let's come on to the economy. Your cabinet colleague Ed Davey thinks he can see green shoots in the economy. Can you see them?
Well, I saw the remarks from the Governor of the Bank of England publishing the bank's inflation report last Wednesday, when he said he saw some more encouraging signs in the economy. And look, at a time when we've created 1.25 million jobs in the private sector, when we've seen positive growth numbers in the first quarter of this year, unlike some of our major European competitors, of course there are some signs of increasing momentum in our... It's not a phrase I would use, but of course there are some signs of increasing momentum.
You remember last time it was used. That's
in our economy. But look, I think what I'd say is it's precisely because of those things that I would say this. Firstly, it's a very, very hard road that we're on. It's going to continue to be hard for a while. But at a time when we're seeing those signs of progress, that would be entirely the wrong time to go back to scratch, to start again with our economic strategy from scratch. Instead, we're going to stick to the plans that we've set out, deliver the deficit reduction as we've set out, but also reform our economy to help businesses grow and create jobs.
You quoted the Governor of the Bank of England. He's less than impressed with your Help to Buy scheme, which is supposed to revive the housing market. He says it's, quote, too close to comfort to being a general state guarantee for mortgages. He's worried that it'll just push prices up.
Well, what the Help to Buy scheme is about is helping those hundreds of thousands of people who
can't afford to make the repayments on their mortgage,
but don't have enough money to scrape together the large deposits that banks are requiring at the moment. We've been very explicit.
So is he wrong to be worried about it?
We've been very explicit that this scheme is limited for 3 years. We've given a lock, actually, to the Bank of England, that we want the Bank of England's new financial policy committee to take a view on this scheme before it's extended. So
look,
this has never been intended to be a
into the
permanent new
market.
feature
You've
of the
given
UK
tax
housing market.
credits
It's a
and tax
temporary
relief
measure
to
to
people buying a
support people
second
who need to
home.
buy a
So
home,
it's
to help the
more fucking
construction
benefits
industry
for the
build
rich.
more houses, because of course that's one part of our economy that's been hit harder than many others.
Fuck off, you wanker.
You're looking at the moment, you're at the centre as Chief Secretary of this need for, in the government's view, of another £11.5 billion of spending cuts for the financial year 2015-16, the year when the election begins. Now, I just want to clarify this. You've ruled out further cuts in welfare spending in this round, and that all the cuts must come from departmental spending. Is that correct?
So in the autumn statement of last year, we took decisions on welfare, including uprating benefits by only 1% for 3 years, and a number of other things too, and decisions on taxation. And we said then in the autumn of last year that the remaining measures would come from departmental spending. That £11.5 billion will come from the spending in government departments, and I think that's it's achievable.
That's interesting. So no welfare. Can I just show you what the Chancellor said today in the Mail on Sunday?
Let's see this.
To see what he has here, because he said by making further cuts, he's writing today, in our day-to-day spending, such as welfare, he's talking about the 2015-16 round, we're able to increase long-term spending on the things that make a difference. The key words there is we make further cuts on spending such as welfare.
Well, of course, as I said, in the autumn statement last year, we made £3.6 billion.
But he's not talking about that. He's talking about the 2015-16 round of cuts. And
if you would just let me
welfare.
explain. In this autumn statement last year, we made £3.6 billion further reductions in welfare in 15-16. In the budget, we announced an extra £3 billion of capital spending for 15-16, precisely making savings in programmes including welfare to enable us to deliver investment in the economy.
Why don't you go after
in the spending
people who
round
are
that is now
avoiding
being
the
conducted,
tax?
we're looking for a further £11.5 billion of savings.
But not on welfare.
That will come from departmental expenditure. We've made welfare savings for that year already, an extra £3.5 billion just a few months ago, and we said then, and I say again now,
why don't you hire
those were the
1,000
welfare
more
decisions
tax
for 15
inspectors and go after
The
the rich
departmental
fuckers
spending
for not
decisions are the
paying the
ones that are now
tax.
going to be made.
So when the Chancellor says making further cuts in day-to-day spending, such as welfare, that does not refer to the 2015-16 spending cuts? Is that correct?
There are further changes to welfare that will take place in 15-16 that we've already announced.
I understand
haven't yet
that,
been delivered.
but it doesn't refer to... There will be no further welfare cuts in this spending round.
I think I've answered that question about 3 times.
No, you
what I've
haven't.
said is the
Well, it's good to
11.5
get clarity,
the
because it doesn't
11.5
often happen.
you often get it from me. The £11.5 billion will come from departmental spending. That's the exercise I'm engaged in at the moment. There's lots of sound and fury around all of this. Actually, I'd say that we're in a better position than I expected at this stage in the process. And, I've been meeting a lot of frontline public service delivery workers from across the public
Cutting
sector.
that money from
and what I get is a
departmental
real
organisations means
sense
that
that
they
there
can't
is
afford to pay
excitement
for
about making change to the way public services
care
can
at
work.
home.
What I want to do in
They
the
can't
spending
pay for,
round is deliver better public services
delivery
for less money.
kids at home.
And
They
that's
can't
what
pay
we're working to achieve.
Old
Let me
age
show you this
pensioners,
picture.
living in,
It's
private
an
accommodation.
innocent bottle of olive oil coming up. You're going to see it. There it is. As of next year, it's banned from restaurant tables because of a Brussels ruling. At a time of over 20 million unemployed in the European Union, isn't that the kind of sort of micro-interference
that we don't
that
need?
explains why you're on the back foot as a pro-European and the Eurosceptics are on the rise?
Well, look, that's pretty silly. And there are many pretty silly things that local councils and indeed central government in this country has done, which is why we're rolling back, as a government, all sorts of regulations.
We elect government and we elect local councils. We don't elect Brussels to do this.
Well, in fact, those decisions are made by ministers in the European Council and elected MEPs in the European Parliament. And look, the European Union is the largest single market in the world. 500 million people,
Sure.
£11 trillion worth of economic activity, 3.5 million jobs in this country dependent on trade with Europe. I really believe that Britain cannot afford to be isolated.
But does that embarrass you?
I really believe that Britain cannot afford to be isolated from our membership of the European Union. It's massively in our economic interest.
But that doesn't help your argument,
No,
does
of course it doesn't. That sort of thing is pretty silly.
When you look at...
But Andrew, the point I'm making is silly rules are not the sole preserve of the European Union. We find them in local authorities. We've swept away many of those in central government too. So I think it's also, if I may say so, not a very strong argument from your point of view.
I haven't got a point of view. I'm simply showing something that's a Brussels rule. When you look at the social and economic carnage that the euro has caused around Europe. Bank accounts raided in Cyprus, the Greek economy disintegrating before our eyes, youth unemployment 57% in Spain. Do you now regret your previous enthusiasm for Britain's membership of the euro?
Well, look, I argued at the time that Britain should join the euro if the economic conditions were right. The economic conditions were not right for Britain to join the euro, and being outside the euro is something which has helped the British
Are you happy
economy
we're outside?
Through those difficult times. I think it's right for us to be outside the euro.
It was good you didn't win the argument.
Well, my argument was we should join when the economic conditions were right. Those conditions never were right, and I'm glad that we're outside the euro now. Look, I also think, by the way, that's a very powerful argument against those people in Scotland who want Scotland to be independent.
All right.
Want to create a monetary union within a broken
but I don't want to go there this morning. I just want to show you this one final thing before we go. This is satisfaction of various people among Conservative members. There is your leader way down there, but you're ahead of Mr Cameron, ahead of Mr Osborne, and you're way ahead of them all among Conservative. How does it feel to be the pin-up boy of Tory party members?
Well, look, if I want, as a Liberal Democrat, to build a strong economy in a fairer society where everyone can get on in life, and if I can help to attract voters to the Liberal Democrats because we're the only party in British politics
I don't think
that's
they're going to vote the Lib Dem.
that's anchored in the centre ground of British politics, that is keeping this government anchored in the centre ground. I can bring people who perhaps once voted Conservative to the Liberal Democrats. I think that would be a marvellous thing.
It's not the meaning of these figures. You like the little halo that was on your head there?
I haven't seen that before.
Yes.
Certainly not from you.
First on the Standard Politics, Danny Alexander. The old phrase, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, doesn't always work in the tribal world of party politics, but there's nothing like a dose of electoral reality to change people's minds. With UKIP making significant inroads into Conservative votes, Giles Dilnot has been investigating if working together
UKIP
would work at all.
BNP late.
Grassroots Conservatives have been keeping a weather eye, swivelled or not, on UKIP. And since the local elections, the success of UKIP in areas like here in North Kent and other parts of the country has been obvious. What the Conservative response to that is less so. And it is the Conservatives this mainly affects, because the very activists and candidates that denuded and damaged their vote are in the main the same people that used to post leaflets and walk the pavements for them. The Tory electoral concern for the future is best expressed in what happened to a Eurosceptic Conservative councillor here in a ward in Sittingbourne when faced with a UKIP candidate.
We're very similar in a lot of ways, and yet they took nearly 2,000 votes off of me. And that cost us our seat and let the Labour in without an increased majority for them of 64 votes, which is nothing. I just think it's a crying shame.
UKIP have said they are already talking to Conservative associations about the possibility of joint candidacy in some form. But when it comes to Westminster, would openly Eurosceptic MPs ever tie themselves to the UKIP banner in some way?
Yes.
If you're a Conservative candidate and you absolutely are chosen as a Conservative candidate, and then another party, in this case UKIP, says actually that candidate, that individual candidate, agrees with a lot of what we agree with, why not let that party endorse you? And therefore you would have a Conservative candidate, but you could also have the UKIP logo on the ballot paper or even on the leaflet.
And then you get the UKIP.
Endorsement is not joint candidates. So, for another MP who thinks it's worth looking at, what would be in it for UKIP?
Decisions that
UKIP
we won't
have
run
very
a
limited
candidate
resources, I would
in your
imagine,
area
as an
because
emerging
your
party. And what we get out of it is that we would have a kind of friendly working relationship with another right-wing party in an area, which means that the Conservative MP or candidate can harness that vote. But that would leave UKIP free, I would imagine, to concentrate their resources and efforts where they don't have the benefits of
Americans,
another
this is
right-wing
very similar
party
to Republicans.
This idea of two logos for one candidate is allowed by changes in the law, though it would need central approval. Or is it just ticking the troublemaker box?
Nick Bowles suggested we should do this with the Liberal Democrats a year ago. He got promoted to be a minister. So I'm not sure why anybody thinks when I suggest it with UKIP that anything would happen other than that. I'm looking forward to my promotion.
So back in Sittingbourne, would a Conservative Association chairman consider such a plan?
You never say never to anything. We would have to consider anything. I would like to see a centre-right government after the next general election so we can put Conservative policies in place. And the recent elections showed that there's been a realignment, not a revolution, in voters, and they've moved centre-right.
There's still plenty of Tory MPs who'd bar the idea, saying it's just an unnecessary headache. But filling up on all available right-of-centre votes in 2015, they might all drink to that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg is a Conservative MP who thinks a deal can be done with UKIP. He's in Somerset, and Jackie Doyle-Price thinks it would be a mistake. She's here in our studio. They both go head-to-head. Jacob Rees-Mogg, let me come to you. You're a Conservative MP, you're a party member. I mean, if you want to support UKIP, why don't you just join UKIP?
Join UKIP, yeah.
Well, what I want to see is a coalition between the Conservative Party and UKIP. We've got a coalition with a party that we broadly don't agree with, and I would prefer to have a coalition with a party that we broadly do agree with.
A right-wing fucking
What would be wrong with that? You would unite the right if you had a coalition with a party that on many things you broadly agree with.
Well, what I want to see is a Conservative majority government, and I think talking about a coalition with anyone is actually self-defeating in attaining that objective. We are representing a very proud party with a distinguished history, and I find it really quite lily-livered of any Conservative politician to be opening talks about pacts at this stage.
Lily-livered, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
And the things you agree on are the far right,
in
not the
a
central
first-past
ground.
system, all political parties end up being coalitions, and within the Conservative Party you have a right wing and a left wing. In the Labour Party you have a socialist element and a social democrat element.
But most people in Britain are
deals
social.
in the past
Not
as
socialist,
a Conservative Party in the late 19th century and in the earlier part of the 20th century to unite those who have a similar view of how the country should be governed. As long as we maintain the first-past-the-post system, which I very strongly support, you need to maximise your side of the political spectrum that will vote for you.
If you don't do a deal with UKIP in at least some constituencies, don't you risk splitting the right-of-centre vote and letting Labour in?
But that prejudges the fact that this is actually a right-of-centre vote that's currently voting for UKIP. I don't believe for one moment that it is. Certainly in the past they've taken votes from the Conservative Party predominantly, but we are now seeing UKIP polling 20% in polls, more than that in local elections. When they're doing that, they're taking votes from more than just the Conservative Party. And I come back, if we're really serious about being government, we need to be very confident about our own platform and go out selling it, not saying, oh, well, if you like UKIP, you can vote for us anyway.
Is it your position, Jacob Rees-Mogg, that if you don't have this kind of arrangement with UKIP as you would like, it makes victory for your party in 2015 less likely?
The lesson of the 1980s with the SDP and the Labour Party is that if you split one wing of politics, then the other wing of politics wins with big majorities. And UKIP voters in opinion polls say that 70% of them would otherwise have been Conservative, 15% Lib Dem and 7% Labour. The rest wouldn't otherwise have voted. So 70% of the UKIP vote is identifiably otherwise Conservative. And interestingly, UKIP is reaching out to some Thatcherite Conservatives that the party has not been able to reach recently.
Are the Conservatives who want to do a deal with UKIP, are they the mad swivelised loons that one of Mr Cameron's allies has supposedly been talking about?
I think they're very misguided. I wouldn't engage in abusing my colleagues, because ultimately we are all colleagues and we are all proud Conservatives, and we all want to see...
Have you seen a few swivelised loons among your colleagues at times, or among your party activists?
I think what I would say is the Conservative Party is a family, and when we fall out, we do actually use personal attacks against each other, but ultimately we are all Conservatives, and we should all be out there working for a Conservative government.
Are you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the swivel-eyed loons?
As well, they're just far the right-wing than...
I'm very close to Conservative associations. Since I was elected, addressed over 50 of them. I find I'm often in agreement with them. And the way I vote in Parliament is not because I've been bullied to do it by anybody, as was suggested in the comment. I do it because it's what I believe in, and I think I believe in true Conservative principles, which the wonderful, fantastic activists and members of our party do, and they're the people who've stuck with us through difficult times and really deserve the greatest respect, admiration and support.
You will know from the Eastleigh by-election and from the local elections that many people who have previously voted Conservative are now voting UKIP. if you want them back, don't you have to do something along the lines of Jacob Rees-Mogg?
I would say that there are many people that we want to vote Conservative currently voting for UKIP. I would also say that UKIP are also taking votes from other parties, and it's because there is a perception that the political debate is not about the issues that really bother the people who determine elections. And quite frankly, what we've seen in the last week is more evidence of that. What we've seen this weekend is more evidence of that. We need to get out there and tell people we are dealing with immigration, we are dealing with welfare, and then people have a positive reason to vote for us.
All right. Jacob Rees-Mogg, is there not a risk that if we go down the road that you would like to go down, that you retoxify the Conservative brand? You've become a rather backward-looking right-wing party again.
I always thought the idea of a toxic Tory party was nonsense. I thought it showed a lack of confidence in our basic political principles. What is rather exciting about the prospect of reuniting the right is that in the local elections, according to BBC's own calculation, on a national level, 48% would have voted for two right-wing parties. And in South Shields, we got, between two right-wing parties, 35% of the vote. That's way up on the levels the Tories were getting, and back to the sort of level Margaret Thatcher was getting.
All right, let me just finish up the gay marriage bill coming up to the Commons next week. Just briefly from you both, I'll come to here in the studio first. How are you going to vote?
I'm not decided yet. I've never been so conflicted about any piece of legislation, I have to say, because I've always been in favour of advancing equality. No, but
you've been around forever. You've got to make up your mind.
It has, but as I say, I'm very conflicted because I've always been in favour of advancing equality, but that bill is a mess.
All right. Jacob Rees-Mogg, how are you going to vote?
Well, I've said before, I'm a Roman Catholic, and I believe it is the right of the Church is to define marriage, not the right of the state. So I shall vote in accordance with the Roman Catholic whip.
So are you taking your whip from the Pope?
On this matter, I am. It's a matter of
Isn't that treason? Isn't that treason? Treason is why we have a Reformation.
I'm glad to say it hasn't been treason since 1829 and the Catholic Emancipation Act.
Is that right?
All right. I didn't realise that Act covered you. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. It's just gone 25 to 12. You're watching the Sunday Politics. Coming up in just over 20 minutes, I'll be looking at the week ahead with our political panel. Until then, the Sunday Politics across the UK.
I'm Arif Ansari. Coming up in the Northwest. Once dubbed the Wild West without a sheriff, now there's a new Manx message over tax.
What we've done will help and has helped to change the offshore perception of the Isle of Man. We're not a tax haven, we're a small international business centre.
No, you're a fucking
And this week we'll welcome someone who's travelled further than normal to join us, the Chief Minister on the Isle of Man, Alan Bell, and closer to home, Debbie Abrahams, the Labour MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth. Now, Debbie, let's start by talking about on-street grooming, because we know that that is an issue for some within the Muslim community. This week we had 7 people found guilty of it in Oxford. How much of an issue do you fear it might be in Oldham?
I think it's an appalling tragedy what's happened to these young girls, and we really need to focus on protecting our children from these sexual predators. And in Oldham, in terms of Operation Messenger, there is a lot of work that's already going on. But I think we need to be very, very clear about suggesting that this relates to one community or another. We know this is widespread across the country as a whole, and it's also affecting all communities.
Yeah, but on-street grooming is a pretty specific issue.
I'm afraid I have to take issue with you there. If you look at the evidence from both the police and or from CEOPS, it is inconclusive, and I think we need to be very, very careful before we get into focusing and targeting any particular community.
Well, let's remember that this all came about because of what happened in Rochdale and the 9 men who were jailed there. Here's what the Rochdale MP Simon Danchuk
dealing with these sort of things are underfunded.
Senior officers in the local authority who set the culture, the very unhealthy culture that saw these girls as
underfunded because
making
it mainly
life
deals
choices,
with minorities.
have walked away from this authority with literally hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we're still waiting for Rochdale Council to publish a report that shows exactly what went wrong.
Well, Simon Danchuk, your colleague's been pretty outspoken over all this. How confident are you that lessons have been learnt?
I think we need to wait and see in terms of the investigation. Simon's quite right that we need to have that published as soon as possible.
Taking a long time, isn't it?
It does seem to be, but we need to learn lessons from that. And if people are found to be wanting, I think they should be doing the right thing.
Now, Alan Bell, as we said, on-street grooming is primarily an issue, I think, for some of those in the Muslim community, but paedophilia is certainly a much wider issue than that.
Yep.
Because of these kinds of issues which have been brought to the fore, has child protection become more of a priority on the Isle of Man? Have you learnt any lessons?
No. Yes, obviously we haven't had the same horrible experience as some
no
parts of the UK have,
shit,
and hopefully we never will. But clearly we follow these cases very, very carefully, and we do our best to make sure we learn the same lessons, in fact, which that the local areas do. I think the one thing we need to be careful about on all this, though, is these are really horrific stories, but the main body of abuse which takes place is often within the family and within friends and behind closed doors. And we mustn't lose sight of the need to focus every bit as much attention on that, because that's very often where this problem originates in the first place.
And indeed so much more difficult to detect.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
Now, who fancies a week away? Well, if you've got kids and you're considering going during term time, it's cheaper, but it's about to become more difficult. The government's clamping down, and this week parents in Bury have had letters, while Lancashire County Council's written to head teachers. Here's Ewan Doak.
These children are where they should be during term time. But pupils at other schools have been taking off when they shouldn't, swapping the classroom for the costers. Their parents save money, so the pressure's on head teachers to explain other potential costs.
I take the time to point out to them the other side of the coin, not just the part about the holiday, but about the child coming back, and their friendships may have moved on, or they may feel that they've missed out on some important piece of work.
If attendance levels drop off, it could trigger an Ofsted inspection. Here, some give up their annual holiday to make sure their children are at school.
We're kind of okay, we're in Supporters Good Books. We just have the time off in the allocated holidays.
We always take her in the school holidays, and we've always done, and that's what we believe in doing anyway.
It's easy extortionate. We have tried looking for holidays, and it's like 3 times more.
When it's the middle of May and it's still raining and cold, some parents may hope they'd be forgiven for wanting some quality family time in the sun. But too much time out of school can affect your children's grades.
If a child's out in their GCSE years for 3 weeks for 15 days, then that can have an impact of downgrading a GCSE performance by up to 1 grade.
Under current rules, head teachers can grant 10 days leave for a family holiday during term time in special circumstances. From September, the Department for Education says schools should only give permission in exceptional circumstances. There's no definition of what exceptional means.
If we're going to have to set parameters, some people are going to feel that they're not being fairly treated. So the head is at the forefront of what's got to be said.
In England, nearly 10% of absences were due to parents taking children out of school during term time. A £60 fine is often far less than the parents save by hitting the beach, when their children should be hitting the books.
So, Debbie, do you support this idea of tightening up the rules?
I think it is absolutely right that children should only be going away out of school in exceptional circumstances. I think in my own case, my eldest daughter, when she was 5, we asked the head teacher's permission to go to my mum's wedding abroad. But it does affect. There is evidence that it does affect students' performance, and parents and schools should be working in partnership to see what the best opportunities and outcomes there are for their children.
I think, Alan, that you follow the British guidelines, so will you also be moving to tighten up?
It's not a major problem on the island, but it is clearly an issue, and we follow what goes on in the UK very closely. Ensuring the children get the best possible education is absolutely top of our priorities. But we do have to understand 2 things, that really these cases should be taken on a case-by-case basis, because there are very strong reasons in some cases that it may be the only opportunity for the family to get together for a small holiday, for a break, at a cheaper cost, because they may not be able to afford the holiday at a different time. That brings quality time for the family. It improves the
You don't need to go
nurturing
to
of the
Spain
children,
on a
and that in
fucking
itself
holiday,
is a
man.
positive which can feed back into the education system.
But that
at the
starts
end
to
of it.
get very difficult, doesn't it? Because if you start to say, well, you know, you can't afford it, therefore you can have the time off, but you probably can afford it, so you can't. How do you start to draw up that kind of rule?
It is a difficult rule to follow, but I do think you need to look at individual cases. In a general rule, I don't think parents should be encouraged to take their children out. There is no question at all. There is clear evidence. It does have detrimental effect on exam results, on educational performance. Parents need to be armed with that knowledge before they make that decision. But I still think ultimately it should be the right of the parent to decide what is in the best interest of their child, except in exceptional circumstances where this is perhaps being abused, in which case there needs to be further action taken.
Possibly nobody wants to leave the Isle of Man anyway with the nice scenery you've got there.
Absolutely true, absolutely true.
I think at the moment you've got 10 days, haven't you, that head teachers have sort of got that leeway if they want, but from what you're saying, perhaps actually there shouldn't be any excuse for taking time off for holidays, except in very exceptional circumstances.
It does need to be, as Alan has just said, I think, on a case-by-case basis, in conjunction with the head teacher. Parents need to decide what is the best in the best interest of the children. But we mustn't forget that the key determinant around educational performance is around poverty. And there's going to be an increase of 1.1 million children living in poverty as a result of this government's changes to the tax and benefit system. That is going to have a direct impact on educational attainment. We should be focusing on those things first.
I'm glad you've mentioned tax, because nobody likes paying it, but some people actively avoid it or even evade it. For some British taxpayers, it's meant putting cash into bank accounts on the Isle of Man. Well, that should become much more difficult with a new financial agreement that's been drawn up between the Manx and British governments. So, with tax high up the international political agenda, here's our Isle of Man reporter, Kelly Foran.
It was once described as the Wild West without a sheriff, as many rich and colourful characters took advantage of the Isle of Man's generous tax breaks. Fast forward a few decades and tax is front page news.
Government has welcomed a decision by the comedian Jimmy Carr to stop using a scheme which allowed him to pay less tax.
And as tax avoiders find themselves on the right side of the law, but the wrong side of public opinion, international pressure against illegal tax evasion is growing.
Tax avoidance and evasion is, I believe, a cancer in Britain's society today.
The government say the Isle of Man being a place to dodge tax is based purely on its history, and they say they've spent the last decade or so trying to move away from that bad reputation. And as finance ministers met in Buckinghamshire, then Brussels this week to plot a global solution to tax evasion, the UK government said the Manx message was a positive one.
There's no doubt the willingness and the determination of the Isle of Man government to ensure that they have a good reputation, and so the net is closing in on those people who've tried to get out of paying their taxes as they're due and try to evade taxes.
The islands agreed with the UK and US to exchange automatically information relating to personal bank accounts, companies and trusts. They've also agreed to work towards a multilateral pilot scheme with the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy and Spain. People who've been hiding investments and assets to avoid tax now have 3 years to come clean. But will there be many?
My guess is that
18
any
fucking
who
months,
were
man,
using
and then
the
you
Isle of
catch
Man,
them and
or
take the
most of
fucking
them,
money off them.
will have pushed off several years ago. But if there are any still left using the Isle of Man, bad luck, guys.
But as the Chancellor stated his case at this week's summit, the island's Treasury Minister questioned his maths, saying bad business was in the past, and they've been leading the move for more openness and transparency.
Bullshit as well. You want to get Ireland and fucking Switzerland involved in as well.
And I feel confident that any business that wouldn't meet current standards would have left the Isle of Man long before now, if it ever was here. We're not a tax haven. We're a small international business centre.
The hemorrhaging of tax revenues on this scale, I think, matters a great deal.
The opposition MP who called for a Commons debate on the issue asked if the Chancellor really has the stomach for a bigger battle.
Of course, one is hypocritical over stopping tax avoidance. The UK controls half the world's tax havens, but he refuses to close them down, which he could. I don't think he's really got the nerve to take on the City of London and big business, which are really, and the super rich, which of course support the Tory party, all of which want him to leave it as it is.
Tax breaks have meant big business for the island. The island's government is hoping these latest agreements will boost its image and help the island take off as a diverse and internationally responsible economy.
And we're also joined from Edinburgh by the tax consultant Ronnie Ludwig. But let me start with you, Mr. Bell. Why have you decided to sign the agreement?
Well, we've worked on these agreements internationally now for well over 10 years. We worked for the OECD when they first established their tax information exchange agreements. We were the first small jurisdiction to commit to that, and we worked very, very closely with the international community ever since. We were the first jurisdiction to give automatic exchange of information on bank accounts to the European Union. That was voluntary. There was no debate going on at that point. We, as you have said, have committed to a automatic exchange with the US, now with the UK, and recently with the new grouping in Europe.
You've been put under pressure to do it.
We have followed this argument. We fully understand where the international agenda is. We have every understanding of the concerns about people paying their fair whack of tax.
You did this with Europe and the US before you did it with the UK, and you're a UK protectorate. You're a fucking wanker.
As long as other jurisdictions as well recognise their responsibility. And there are issues in the UK and the US and in Europe that they have to tidy up, as well as some of the small jurisdictions.
Well, let's speak to Ronnie Ludwig there in our Edinburgh studio. And how much of a step forward is this agreement to stop people avoiding tax, Mr. Ludwig?
Well, I think it's a huge step forward. Of course, it's very, very important to point out that not everybody or every organisation which has a bank account in, whether it be the Isle of Man or any of the other British overseas territories, has that account to evade or even avoid tax. And also it's important to point out that there's a huge difference between tax evasion, which is completely illegal, and tax avoidance, which is perfectly legal, albeit that some people and organisations push the envelope on it. But this agreement, I think, is a big step forward. Unfortunately, I don't think it goes far enough, because a lot of these people set up structures which are fairly complex structures in order to hide the audit trail, as it were, straight back to the ultimate beneficiaries. So you'll typically have, and I'm not necessarily speaking about the Isle of Man here, but this is just generally, perhaps offshore trusts with umpteen offshore companies operating underneath them, with offshore directors, and so it's very difficult often to get back to whoever actually is the beneficial owner of these accounts. And that's the next big thing, I think, that the government in the UK and governments internationally need to cooperate on to actually establish that audit trail and get back to the ultimate owner.
What do you think, Debbie? Is this enough?
It's a move in the right direction, but why is it taking so long? It's 120 billion is estimated to be in terms of tax evasion and tax avoidance. That's a tax gap. Why, as I said, why has it taken so long? It just shows, as Michael Meacher has just said, where the government's priorities are, and they're not up to actually challenge and hold to account these powerful vested interests. It's an absolute amazing fact to me that there are more staff that are administering child benefit cuts in revenues and customs than there are in the combined units of the offshore and affluence units. That says it all.
But one reason it's taken so long is because your government didn't do it.
We've admitted, where our shortcomings are, and I wouldn't deny that whatsoever. But this government has been in power for 3 and a bit years now. And not far enough, as Alan has said, these are preparations around tax, cutting down on tax evasion and avoidance are things that we put into place to start with. It's just not enough, and it shows where the government's priorities are.
Just mention the one point that was raised about beneficial ownership. The Isle of Man is well ahead of the United Kingdom on knowing the beneficial owner of all its entities. We have regulation of companies, of trusts. The UK have none of that. You have a long, long way to go to catch up with the Isle of Man.
Would you be willing to provide that information to the British government?
We will be doing that, absolutely.
You will be doing that?
Absolutely. We need to see the UK following us and doing the same thing. The UK have got catch-up to do on this. It's not just the fault of small jurisdictions.
I mean, one thing that you've always argued very vociferously in the past, Alan, is that the Isle of Man is not a tax haven.
Absolutely.
But how else can you explain the need for this agreement if you aren't?
We have been open and transparent with the UK and the international community now for a great many years. We exchange information. We have that information available. This is simply formalising what, in fact, has existed now for quite a number of years.
Well, no, this is going further. This is providing more information more easily to the British government, which you weren't doing before.
We have an agreement to exchange information automatically with the European Union. As far as I know, the UK is still part of the European Union, and therefore they were beneficiaries from this agreement. We have exchanged this information. I think if you're looking for culprits in all this, you need to look way beyond the shores of the Isle of Man and into some of the larger economies, and indeed to some of the smaller jurisdictions, perhaps in Asia, as well as just around the British Isles.
Let's speak to Ronnie Ludwig again, because part of this deal, as I understand it, is that it's about taxing the interest on people's money in Isle of Man bank accounts. What do you make of that?
Well, that's fine as far as it goes. As I said at the beginning, it's a step in the right direction. But you've got to wonder about the principal sums which were lodged in these accounts to start with. And should these sums themselves have been liable to tax? And this could stem from a wide range of activities which have not been declared, so, I don't know, like internet trading or whatever. So whilst it's great that we're going to catch up on tax on the interest, a far, far bigger fish to fry, in my view, is the principal sums that were lodged in these accounts to start with.
And do you see any signs that that's going to happen?
No, it's not going to happen.
I think it probably will happen. I mean, the government is very active in countering tax evasion. We've seen a lot of progress,
it's only going to happen
notwithstanding the frustrations, which I completely understand that your other speakers have mentioned. A lot of progress over the last 3 or so years that the government's been in power, and they are trying to tackle this. But it's a huge, thorny problem. And as one of your other contributors said, it goes way, way beyond simply the Isle of Man or British overseas dependencies. This is a global problem, and it needs a global solution involving governments around the world.
It's not far enough. It's the tax gap, as I say, 120 billion. That's 90% of the NHS budget. It's not far enough.
What do you make of the point that he was making?
It's a valid point, but it raises another big issue for the UK, not for the Isle of Man. It's right to know where the capital sums come from, and we have a very strict know your customer regime in our banking system. We have to know where the source of that funds come from. The bulk of those funds comes from the UK banking system. It's transferred from the UK into the Isle of Man.
This is what I was saying, but you set up an agreement with Europe and the US
what's happening in the UK banks that you haven't got the same know your customer regime in the UK as we have in the Isle of Man. Otherwise, that question wouldn't have got asked in the first place.
Well, we thank Ronnie Ludwig for asking it. Thank you for your time there in Edinburgh.
You're welcome.
Time now for the political roundup in 60 seconds.
I like this.
The only emergency night shelter in Salford and Manchester has closed after losing its funding. Salford City Council says legally it had no choice. A couple on the Isle of Man have called for a change in the law after they were banned from renting a flat because they're gay.
It was a matter of just shocked and disbelief.
A deal's been done to run Cumbria County Council more than a week after the local elections. Labour's going into coalition with the Lib Dems. Still on track, but should it be? The spending watchdog, the National Audit Office, says the economic benefits of high-speed rail to the northwest are unclear.
They need to be more specific about where they think those economic benefits are going to come from and how, how they implement the programme.
And experts gathered in Liverpool to tackle an expanding problem. They chose the second most overweight region in the country for the European Obesity Congress.
Fat people should be talking about obesity.
So, Debbie, the gay couple there on the Isle of Man who weren't allowed to rent, what do you make of that?
It's appalling this day and age that still happens. And we remember back in 2010, I think it was a similar case for a B&B. In the UK, we have very clear laws when public services have been provided or there's commercial interest.
Are you surprised it still happens?
It is appalling, isn't it?
Alan, what are you going to do about it, if anything?
I have to say, I was absolutely shocked when I heard this. I think we need to, first of all, though, just realise it is just a one-off instance. It's not a reflection of widespread homophobia in the Isle of Man. I think we put all that behind us now.
It takes a long time to change those kinds of attitudes.
It does, and I
suddenly...
fully accept the rights of individuals to have their own religious views, and I don't dispute that. But in this day and age, where you have a loving relationship, we have two people who care about each other, simply want to set up home together, it is outrageous that they should be discriminated against because of their sexuality. I will be, and in fact I've already started to look at the equalities legislation on the island, and I hope we'll be able to fill any gaps there may be very shortly.
What do you think that the Isle of Man government should do?
Well, we have the 2007 Equalities Act, I'm sure, which is specifically looking at regulations around sexual orientation, so I'm sure there's something to take from there.
I mean, you did say that in terms of other legislation, we were talking, for example, about education earlier, that you've got similar legislation to the UK government. Is that something that you perhaps need to adopt there?
Yes, I mean, we have quite extensive equalities legislation anyway already on the island. We have our own Human Rights Act with signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights. So we have the bulk of that legislation is already in place. But clearly from this, there are one or two areas of deficiency, and we will be following up that very shortly.
OK, Alan Bell, thank you very much indeed for coming over from the Isle of Man. It's good to have you, and thank you to you too, Debbie Abrahams. Now we return to London and Andrew Neil.
In a moment, we'll look ahead to the big stories that will dominate politics next week with our political panel. But first, the news at noon with Maxine Mulwiney.
Good afternoon. The former Foreign Secretary Lord Howe has said that David Cameron appears to be losing control of the Conservative Party and running scared of his Eurosceptic MPs. His comments have been dismissed by the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who said Mr Cameron is tackling a difficult issue within the party and had already delivered much in changing Britain's relationship with the EU, as Robin Brandt reports.
This was Geoffrey Howe in 1990, telling Parliament why he'd quit the government because he disagreed so strongly with the then Prime Minister over Europe.
That is why I have resigned.
Now, 23 years later, in a rare intervention, he's attacking another Prime Minister from his party over the UK in the EU. In an interview with The Observer, the veteran peer says David Cameron's promise to renegotiate has opened a Pandora's box. He goes on to say the Tory party is now running scared of its own backbenchers. And on the state of the Conservatives, he says a deep anti-Europeanism has infected the soul of the party.
Never liked how
if the result of such a referendum was to suggest our detachment from the European Union, it would be of grave effect, because our presence there gives us influence throughout the world.
It's been a week when the Tories appeared to obsess over Europe. Another party grandee, Lord Lawson, said the UK should leave now. Then more than 100 of his own MPs voted against the Prime Minister over the lack of plans for a referendum law.
Everyone is saying it is in meltdown now.
At the top, though, one senior minister said they're in agreement.
If you look at the policy issue here, it is, do we need to do something to make our relationship with Europe different? And on that issue, there is absolute unity, and I think that's, a really important change.
David Cameron's promised to renegotiate the UK's terms of membership. From his own side, the pressure's on to hurry up.
But what I and my colleagues want him to do now is to get on with that negotiation, because we think the new relationship has to be based on trade. It mustn't be based on common government.
So the Prime Minister's caught between a rowing old guard and a group of his own MPs impatient about change. To some, he's a leader struggling to keep it together. Robin Brandt, BBC News.
A former employee of the internet giant Google says he is providing evidence to the tax authorities about how the company avoided paying corporation tax in Britain by using its offices in Dublin to finalise deals. Barney Jones, who worked at Google for 4 years until 2006, claims at that time some deals were still completed in Britain. Google says it can't comment on the specific allegations but maintains it complies fully with the UK tax law. The funeral is taking place this lunchtime of a senior politician in Imran Khan's Movement for Justice party who was shot dead yesterday. Sarah Shahid Hussain was killed outside her home in Karachi on the eve of a partial rerun of last Saturday's election. The police are investigating whether her death was politically motivated or the result of an attempted robbery. Now, they worked together for more than 4 decades, leaving their mark on British comedy. And today, the comedians Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise are being honoured with a plaque at Teddington Studios in southwest London, where the duo recorded some of their most memorable programmes, It will be unveiled shortly by Eric Morecambe's widow Joan and his daughter Gail. That's all the news for now. There will be more news on BBC One at 6 o'clock. Now it's time to go back to Andrew.
Andrew! Thanks, Maxine. So, more trouble for David Cameron over same-sex marriage. The fallout from Mr Farage goes to Edinburgh, and the evils of tax avoidance. All questions for this week. So it never rains but it pours, Miranda, does it, for David Cameron? He's indeed, it all plays into it, doesn't he? He's got this gay marriage vote coming up again, and this whole row over the swivel-eyed loons, it all plays into that.
Well, it does, and we've learned this weekend that several of the constituency associations of the Conservative Party have actually written to High Command in protest at the swivel-eyed loons remark, but also, of course, this equal marriage bill, as those of us who are in favour of it like to call it, is the thing that really, really irritated the Conservative associations, and that's the thing which they say resulted in a sort of hemorrhaging of membership away to UKIP. So it really, really comes at the worst possible moment that this should come back to the Commons.
It all sort of plays into this narrative, which I see is gaining speed in some self-serving quarters, I put it no higher than that Mr Cameron is losing control of his party.
Yeah, and I think the compound effect of this story and the remarks allegedly made by a Number 10 insider is what really matters. Individually, they're not too bad. Put them together, and it just smells like a leader losing control of his party. I do think that David Cameron has got himself into the worst position in that he's advancing a controversial piece of legislation, so he takes all the political damage that comes with that. But because he's not making the case for it, and he's not putting his face and voice to it, he seems almost embarrassed by the bill. He's not getting any credit from the people who do believe in same-sex marriage. And so you've got a situation where, look, it's an esoteric issue for a lot of voters, but it still commands majority support. It commands particular support from exactly the voters that Tories need, namely the young. And more than anything, it kind of softens out the Tory message, which is generally crime, immigration, Europe, welfare. And so there is a huge amount of political utility to it, but you only claim it if you put your face and voice to the campaign and lead on the issue, and David Cameron hasn't.
The problem with equal marriage for David Cameron is it's so 2008. It's so the period when he was sort of chasing after my newspaper and The Observer, and that has all gone. And what's interesting about this, we're saying he doesn't control his party. These votes are technically not rebellions. Europe last week, equal marriage next week, are technically not rebellions. They're free votes. And yet free votes are turning into real trouble for David Cameron. Europe are trouble, not because the Conservative Party is divided, but the coalition is divided. And equal marriage next week. Yes, ministers can vote as they want, but Philip Hammond on Question Time on Thursday night, attacking the government, his government, for devoting so much time to
But for a lot of natural Tory supporters, it's also a proxy for bashing Cameron on a wider issue. He could probably have got away with this without too much of a row if the economy was growing at 3% and the Tories were 5 points ahead in the polls.
Well, and let's not forget that they still harbour great resentment against their own leader for not winning an outright majority at the next election. The great irony is, the more we have these rebellions that aren't really rebellions, as Nick points out, the less likely it is that they will win a majority at the next election. So they're shooting themselves in the foot.
And the problem is, equal marriage is meant to appeal to the centre ground. Europe is meant to appeal to the right.
Which
and
is why
you cannot
UKIP
get that formula. That was the formula Thatcher had. Centre ground and the right. You
Party.
cannot get that formula. And as Miranda's saying, that means we're looking at more sort of minority coalition administrations.
Well, you remember the famous movie Mr Smith Goes to Washington? Let's have a look and see what happened when Mr Farage went to Edinburgh.
Immigrants are welcome here. You're not welcome here.
You're no welcome here, you fucking fascist fucker.
Edinburgh had to be protected by police as he was jeered by a crowd that suddenly gathered quite quickly. But he retreated into a city centre pub for his own safety, which I guess for Mr Farage is not a great hardship to have to be in the pub, but then he had to be ferried out of there as well. This was a group of hard left activists that had got together and they gave Mr Farage a bad time. It was interesting though that they were shouting "racist scum, go home."
Yes.
How does that work?
Indeed. I mean, we are a United Kingdom just about, and he's leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party. I mean, it is interesting. This was not the SNP, obviously.
No.
It was people on the far left, on the extreme wing.
Well,
of the
you don't know who these people were. They're ordinary Scottish people on the street, you fucker.
And I spoke to Lord Forsyth, the last Conservative Scottish Secretary. I spoke to George Fawkes, the former Labour Scottish Office Minister.
Yeah, people
and George
who are
Galloway,
in the fucking
hardly a sort of
administration,
fellow
people who are
traveller of the
already in
Conservative
there
and
making
Labour.
money
And they
out of
all said the
politics.
same thing. What this has shown is there is quite an ugly side to some elements of the nationalist debate, the independence debate. They're saying these people are on the periphery.
you.
This is not the SNP.
This is the ordinary
There
Scottish
is
people
this
saying
quite
we don't
ugly
want
side.
fascist
And what the
bastards in
Farage incident
government.
did is it highlighted that.
I mean, you're in a better position than most to answer this. If that happened in Edinburgh, what would have happened in Glasgow?
Yeah.
I can just imagine him leaving almost physically damaged by the...
we'd probably thrown eggs at them and stones and fucking
There is
bottles
that. There is that.
You know,
I mean, my take on it is that... as
Don't
horrible-
fall for this. Edinburgh's the soft city and Glasgow's the hard one. Train Spotting was set in Edinburgh.
So 2 cities of the Enlightenment, not one. But I think that... I thought as awful as it was to see a Democratic politician intimidated like that, it didn't strike me as a peculiarly Scottish thing. You can imagine on any left-wing campus that kind of incident occurring. And there is that element of liberal
Just
opinion.
briefly, because I want to get on to one
But
more
also,
thing.
I think, UKIP are playing in the big league now, and they're going to have to prepare better. I mean, your clip said protected by the police, not protected terribly well.
No.
If they are going to say unpopular things all around the country, they're going to have to organise themselves a bit better and take it on the chin.
Dominated the media in Scotland where I was on Friday night.
It was violent
and
in
he
as
played
much
it
as what
actually
people
to his
said.
advantage in
There
the
was
end.
no actual
Let's
physical
move on to
violence
avoiding
perpetrated
tax.
on-
Is
we
that
are
evil?
a democratic
Is that an evil
nation,
thing to do?
but
This is
they
what happened
feel
when
that
Google
the
approved
freedom
the
of
World Parliamentary
speech
Committee on
is
Thursday.
open to
For
us.
a company that says you do no evil, and I think you do evil in that you use smokes and mirrors.
I don't
to
think it's a
avoid
matter
paying
of,
tax.
but I think tax is not a matter of choice. Tax is a matter of following the laws that are there internationally.
A lot of outrage, Nick, growing on the left and the right. I think Mr. Miliband's going to make a speech about it this week as well. Outrage, but I don't see anybody coming up with a solution to get these guys to pay their taxes.
Well, that's right. They may do one E, evil, but they don't do the crucial E, which is evasion. But it looks like they do A's and possibly 2 A's, which is not just avoidance, but aggressive tax avoidance. And it's interesting, the Prime Minister will be hosting the G8 summit in Northern Ireland next month, and he's putting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance on the agenda. And it looks like Sunday Times have got a story on the
There
front
should
page
be no such
with a
thing as tax
whistleblower
avoidance.
from Google
You should either
saying,
pay
"I've
your
got
tax
evidence,
or
I've
you
got
evade
emails,"
tax.
which shows
We need
that
to
Google
change
is
the
generating
fucking laws
billions
so
of
that you
pounds of
either
revenue
pay your
in the
tax
United
or
Kingdom
you're
and
evading
running it
tax.
through its Dublin office, which is its European HQ. That
That
looks
way we
like
can
it's
catch the
avoidance. The question
evaders
is
and
it
force them to
aggressive
fucking pay
avoidance?
their tax.
And if it is aggressive avoidance, then I think they may find the authorities will be looking closely at them.
Well, also, these companies shouldn't be surprised to be approached in this spirit by the whole of the political class in this country.
No, when people are paying their taxes and struggling to meet bills, they get angry.
Absolutely, but both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor also have used the language of morality in the budget, in speeches about this very issue, and then newspapers such as The Times have then gone on to expose through investigation, so they should not be surprised, and executives should be more prepared.
But it seems to me, it used to be the evils of big oil. Mind you, they're still fixing prices, some allege, of big oil, but all the big capitalist companies. These cuddly, new age companies like Google and Starbucks, they turn out to be just the same.
Yeah, I think they're regressing some of the morally pretentious campaigns they used to run about 10 years ago when they first emerged. I mean, you're right to say that there is outrage on the left and the right, but I just think that means the left and the right are both wrong. If you're not breaking the law, then it's up to the politicians to change the law to take account of these
so
loopholes.
there isn't avoidance.
And would you
and
want
there's
to live in
only
the kind of
fucking,
economy where businesses pay the amount of tax
that they fucking
public
owe?
pressure indicates they should pay? If you're the
Exactly.
treasury of the country, you can't predict
You pay
what
tax
your revenues are
or
going to
you
be.
evade
It's
tax.
an
There should
incredibly
be no
capricious
avoidance
system on which to base fiscal
legislation
policy.
in the fucking
And that's
tax
why
bill.
we rely on criminal justice and the tax code. And until Google and Starbucks violate those, I think there's a limit as to how angry you can be.
We shall see if
I'm
anything
fucking
happens
angry as fuck
out of all this outrage. That's it for today. Parliament's going into recess next week. The poor dears, they need a holiday, so are we. We have to follow them, you know. We'll be back with all the big political stories in 2 weeks' time. Remember, if it's Sunday, it's the Sunday politics. Unless, of course, it's Whitson.
Anyway, thanks very much, guys, for watching this. If you watched all the way through, it's been enlightening. I would imagine if you live in another country other than the UK. If you're in the UK, it's probably likely to you as well if you watch it, and you probably don't watch it. Too busy watching Big Brother or Britain's Got Talent or fucking Singing Stars or whatever fucking shit. You know. Anyway, thank you very much, guys, for watching this show.